Well, thank you. This is a very great honor to say a few words in the opening of Xenofon's exhibition. It was Franz Kafka who said that it is the duty of the artist to wield his pen like an ice pick to smash the frozen sea inside us. And this provocative exhibition does precisely that. It raises our eyebrows to think that this work, all the work of individuals that other individuals have a right to see without censorship, should at some stage or another have been censored, banned, people arrested for possessing it. But it has always been thus. Censorship is all around us. You look, the super injunctions, there was the most ridiculous piece of censorship a few days ago by the BBC when an Australian comedy team called the Chaser were going to take a feed of the royal wedding on a minority channel and add their own commentary. The palace refused to allow that to happen and required the BBC to not deliver the feed of the royal wedding to Australia if there was any fun to be made by comedians of the royal wedding. That is just one minor example of how censorship has been always around us. And it goes back in British traditions as long as I suppose it goes back to Caxton and the printing press. In the 13th century, we had the crime of scandalatum magnatum, which was a crime for making fun of people who were highly placed, the great persons of the realm, to suggest that any of them were involved in scandal, involved you in being prosecuted, sometimes having your nose slit, sometimes having a firebrand for SL, for seditious libeller. And of course, the Star Chamber in the 17th century enforced the law of sedition. It was political censorship. And John Milton, the great poet, railed against it. He said, this censorship is like the exploit of that gallant farmer who thought he'd keep out the crows by shutting the park gate. And that was Milton's famous Areopagitica, which was the great cry against censorship, a call to the Parliament of England to think what sort of individuals you are, capable of sustaining and hearing and sorting out what is true from what is false. Of course, in later years, we've seen sedition and blasphemy, these laws, abolished. They've been abolished only in the last year. And having an exhibition like this makes us think of all those courageous booksellers who went to prison and often died in prison, only in the early 19th century, for selling the works of Tom Paine, The Age of Reason, The Rights of Man were prosecuted, and the booksellers who were Paine himself escaped with the help of William Blake, the poet, to France. But his booksellers were jailed sent for years of hard labor, and many of them died in prison for their determination that human imagination, that an attempt at the truth should be published. So an exhibition like this makes us think of those great figures of courage. Of course, in recent times, we've had the Terrorism Act, and this exhibition focuses particularly upon the idea that hit Parliament and hit other parts of the West, that any description of Islamic ideology could be capable of glorifying terrorism. Now, the crime was then brought in sections 57 and 58 of the Terrorism Act, of glorifying terrorism. It's a ridiculous crime. What does it apply to? A favorable biography of Robespierre? It is quite absurd. And yet, taken seriously, people, the authorities really did believe that people act out what they read. And the act of political censorship is essentially an act of inability to recognize that individuals can have free will and can decide for themselves. The idea that we're all so weak that we follow what is said. A few years ago, of course, in the late 70s, I came across the Anarchist Cookbook because it was actually used as part of a prosecution here of Ronan Bennett, who's now quite a well-known playwright, and Iris Mills. I represented Iris Mills in a trial at the Old Bailey, and the evidence against them on the charge was that they had possession of the Anarchist Cookbook, they had weed killer, and they had sugar in their home. So with sugar, weed killer, and the Anarchist Cookbook, they were guilty of planning a terrorist atrocity. Now, we called evidence that showed that they had moved into this flat which had a garden, and they had someone, I called a witness who'd actually been with them when they bought the weed killer to kill the weeds in their garden. Of course they had sugar because they drank tea with sugar, but that was enough to put them on trial at the Old Bailey. The judge thought they were guilty, the jury fortunately did not, and that was one occasion when the jury stood up for the right of free speech. But only 5 years ago, it's amazing to think, I defended a Libyan in the courts of this country who was charged under Section 57 with possessing a document which was a blueprint for a democratic Libya that envisaged the killing of Gaddafi in order to obtain it. And he was on every defense that we put up was rejected as a matter of law. Section 57 was said to be simply a question of whether this was capable of assisting a terrorist act. And it mattered not that the terrorist in question was, that the head of state in question happened to be the world's greatest terrorist. This document was, there could be no defense of public interest available. And this Libyan gentleman was jailed for 3 years. The Court of Appeal upheld his conviction on the basis that the law would have jailed Nelson Mandela had he been found in similar circumstances with an ANC publication. So it is a draconian law, and it is amusing to think that we are now trying our best to overthrow the regime that our terrorism act supported. Section 57 and 58 were used only a few years ago to jail and put under control order some Libyan freedom fighters whom we are now supporting. And that is how dangerous Section 57 and 58 can be. We are now, I've just come from talking about the new act of censorship, and again, what is counterproductive, because censorship, in my view, is usually counterproductive. What the Pentagon is holding back at the moment is a grisly picture of Osama bin Laden laid out with bullet holes after being executed. There is now no question. Executed, indeed murdered by America, or by the Navy SEALs, and the admission now that he was unarmed and was simply shot. That picture, which America is at the moment withholding, will become, I suspect, as iconic as the picture of Che Guevara on the slab, and it will be, for that reason, a different form of art, a form of art that makes us think about the right of governments to decree the death of inconvenient individuals, whether they be the worst criminal in the world, whether they be Salman Rushdie, whether they be Julian Assange. So these questions are raised by this courageous exhibition. I pay tribute to our artist and to the gallery for daring to raise them. Thank you.